Well, as you know, or maybe you don't know, I don't know, we Servants of Mary belong to a worldwide order, a very old order that started way back in the 1200s. And so we thought we'd have Father John to share some reflections about all that with you. And certainly, who better to do that, because the men were the first community before any of the sisters. And so he can, elaborate on that also. But so join me now in welcoming Father John Fontana.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I thank Margaret, first of all, for inviting me to be here. I thought she was just going to say, we're a very, very old order, so we got one of the old guys from Chicago. It's so nice to see an awful lot of you, some of whom, you said going up changes it or going down?
Going down.
Okay, I knew it was going to be one or the other. I had a 50% chance of being wrong. Although I've known a lot of the Servites for a long time, the person here that I've known the longest is Mary Eileen Kelly Andreessen. I just figured out 46 years we've known each other. We met at First Communion, or was it kindergarten? No, it was in college. We can't deny it. So I do thank you to help continue what seems to be a party. I was in Denver a couple weeks ago, and the party bus was there, and I know it's been in Portland, and it's heading to Detroit. So I'm glad to be part of the party at two of your different places. Happy anniversary to all of my Servite sisters, and thank you, the rest of you, for coming to this. People often wouldn't be excited to come to an not historic presentation, but a presentation about history. But we had the salad first, and so we're following the tradition of Jesus, who made it very clear. He didn't say, do this and remember me, talking about a committee meeting. He said, when you're eating and drinking, remember me, or remember me when you're eating or drinking. So we are disciples of a very wise person who in one of those scriptural books said, if you feed them, they will come. It should be in the Bible. All right, so it's not. But so as our bodies are digesting our salads now, I'd like to invite you to turn on your imaginations and see this Servite order, this order that had its founding in medieval time, as a kind of, I knew it wouldn't work the first time. What am I doing wrong?
Probably nothing. It's probably it. There.
Okay.
Is that the second one? No.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, all right.
To see the order as a tree, which is actually Sister Margaret's image, and we talked about it, and so I said I would introduce it, although she sees this whole development, as well as the history itself, as being an order that started as a tree with branches that eventually were added on. The tree was first planted in 13th century Italy, as she said, with the different branches, not only of the tree, but the branches of the order, coming off of that tree during nearly 800 years of history, including the France, London, Omaha branch of the tree. And one of you will be talking about that in the future. Do you have that? No, you have the, I don't know who's doing that part.
Mary.
That's Mary doing that.
Mary tries to.
Unfortunately, I get the trunk. That's all I get. Someone else gets to get the blossoms and the leaves and the fruit and whatever else develops as a result of the growth. I just get the trunk to talk about the beginnings of the order and its spirituality. But ever since I heard a comment by Conrad Borntrager, who many of you know, our best Servite U.S. historian, at least among the men, he said something that always makes me think I can't talk about the trunk without talking about the roots. Because the trunk is going to be empty and hollow without roots. And so the way he said it wasn't so much an organic image as a tree, but one that works very well for an order that started in Italy, and that was a pizza. And that's why the tree and the pizza are sharing a slide up there. He said all the toppings of a pizza can be good, and you can talk to death about each topping, but it means nothing if it's not part of the crust, the dough, on which it is formed, on which it is placed. So we can't talk about a religious community, even a really tasty, spicy one like our own, planted, without talking about the fact that it was planted in something deeper, rooted in the gospel and the mission of Jesus, in whose name we're gathered. And in the Friars' Constitution, it's right there in the first line of the Constitutions that we are gathered in the name of Jesus. So Franciscans and Dominicans, and maybe even Jesuits, but I thought I'd stay with Catholics. That was mainly for you, but it's for others. And even Jesuits exist in order to continue the mission of Jesus in their own way, in a particular way, having been given certain gifts or charisms by the Holy Spirit to be shared with others. And the greatest moments of renewal over these almost 800 years of history have been when we have returned to the roots, as Vatican II invited all of us to do, to go back to a Servite way of incarnating the Word of God, in relationship especially with the woman in whom the Word was first incarnated, made flesh. So we are first and foremost disciples of Jesus. That might be sort of something that's obvious, but it's so funny that when I was in St. Louis, the bishop once said, you know, there are a lot of parish mission statements that are really beautiful about what you do, but some of them don't happen to mention Jesus in them. And so we laughed until we looked at our mission statement. Jesus was missing in action. So we are first and foremost disciples of Jesus, living out his gospel, but doing it in the spirit of 7 merchants in 13th century Florence, who discovered a particular manner of living together and serving others under the inspiration of Mary of Nazareth. They met in a city. Shortly after, they went up a mountain, and then they started spreading out to all kinds of other places. And I'd like to use those 3 geographical realities as a way of talking about 3 major aspects of the Servites. The city is where the Servites gathered into a community, a fraternity. So that's kind of the city topic, the first principal element. They developed a simple life of prayer, contemplation, when they went onto the mountain, or when they felt they needed to go to the mountain because of a call to prayer and contemplation. Dedicated as they were and as we are today, and inspired by the woman of faith and servant of God from Nazareth, who listened attentively, who heard the word of God and then acted on it, which was the best compliment that Jesus ever gave to his mother when he said, you know, it's not the woman who fed me, it's the woman who believed. And of course, I'm always thinking of what Mary might have looked like at the first part of that quote, when he said, you know, who's my mother and brothers? After all I went through, you're going to ask who my mother is. Mac. But then he paid her the highest compliment possible. And then from community in the city and prayer on the mountain, just to simplify it, they would go out to what in some ways was often a desert, full of thirsting and often hurting people who needed to be served, who needed the compassionate service that is the third main development, or the third main component of our spirituality. Community inspired by Mary with that whole experience of prayer and compassionate service. The way that we balance community and service is constantly changing, but it's always inspired, at least in the ideal. And there are enough of you here who've either lived Servite life or you've known Servite men for a long time. You know that I'm talking about a lot of ideals that we don't always live up to. But in the ideal, it's inspired by Mary of Nazareth, though it is always changing. It's articulated in our constitutions with these words, and in a couple of places with quotes. I'll put the words up. Oh, that goes really fast. How do I go back now? I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, well, got it.
Is this it?
That's it.
All right, good. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
And you know what, if that's troublesome, you can always use these.
No, it's not troublesome. I'm just troubled.
That's okay.
So what I've just said in a way is summarized in the Friars' Constitution by these words. Moved by the Spirit, we commit ourselves, as did our first fathers, to witness the gospel in fraternal communion, to be at the service of God and all people, drawing abiding inspiration from Mary, Mother and Servant of the Lord. I'm going to share a few things with you now. There aren't a whole lot of minutes to talk, and the last thing, especially after lunch, that I want to do is a bunch of names and dates that we're not going to remember or probably care about and fall asleep.
Yes, we do.
I also have to watch one. I always get a little spooked when there's a camera aimed at me. I said we could do this for Marion. It brings back a memory of a woman in Belleville, Illinois, who taped a presentation I gave to a lay formation presentation or session, and she said, "Don't worry about the camera. The only person who's going to see it's the bishop." I said, "Thank you. I feel much better now." So I'd ask you to listen, not just with your ears, but listen with your hearts, so that some of what really has been flowing from our roots and our origins in the trunk of this Servite tree might remind us of what is still growing within us, what's still blossoming, what's still nourishing us today, whether we are Servites, as about half of us in the room are, or whether we are in relationship with Servites in one way or another, or somehow part of the story and spirit of the servants of Mary. So let's see if I learn by my mistake and do better with it. Yeah! The city. The first of those three elements of our community and the place where we started. Although 13th century Florence had fewer people than Omaha in it, it was a growing urban population center. At a time when both the noble upper class and the institutional church were rather shaky and decadent and in need of spiritual reform. Nothing like today. It was in this climate that this new and middle class, a merchant class, arose. It appeared. And it created in the middle of it this desire for renewal. And there were certain bright lights, especially like Francis and Dominic, who became signs of a Christian springtime that was badly needed in the middle of winter. This major shift in the 13th century also affected the personal identity of these 7 lay merchants who were somehow brought together. First of all, as members of a Marian confraternity. Also people who volunteered time working as hospitalers. They did something with people who were sick. And with a particular sensitivity to the needs of the church and the world of their time. Unfortunately, they didn't leave anything in writing. Some of the founders have all kinds of things that the communities can go back to and quote and learn and develop. Our guys didn't leave anything in writing. It's amazing that we're still around almost 800 years later. It really is the gift of the Spirit, because we don't have that to go back to. So a lot of what I'm talking about is the result of piecing together of later documents and some speculation of what might have happened. We don't really have details even about the personalities of the 7 founders. You might find them on some websites. There are a couple of Catholic websites who know everything about each one of them, and I have no idea where they got it from. Because we don't know that. Except Bonfilius was one who seemed to have stood out as a leader, and Alexis is mentioned as well, perhaps partly because he was the family of the Falconiaries, related to Juliana, who is the traditional foundress of the women's congregations of Servites. So we have a legend that Mary appeared to the 7 in 1233. And I just included this not so much to give you a picture of what it might look like for Mary to appear to them, and it happened to be also the birth of St. Philip, so it's probably done in retrospect. But it just always reminds me that when I was in the novitiate with a rather creative and funny guy, every now and then, especially at feast, he would act out the scene of Mary's apparition to the 7. And he would always do the same routine, and we would keep laughing at it anywhere, where he'd say, okay, there are 7 of you now. I got a few smalls, a few mediums, and a few larges. You get the small, you get... The fact is, we're talking about 13th century Italy. They were probably all smalls, or smallish. The first document that even mentions servants of Mary comes 12 years later, in 1245. And the first actual Servite document that we have, extant, is from 1251. And that was a corporate vow of poverty. And at that point, there were about 20 friars who pledged themselves to putting everything in the same pot. We have all kinds of variations and interpretations of what poverty means today, but anyway, they wrote this corporate vow. And if I had more time, I'd give you a quote about the punishment that was promised to anybody who broke it. And I'm so glad that I didn't live at that time. Another document that is called the Legenda, which means it's partially true, but it's put together in different pieces. A looser kind of document called the Legenda de Origine was written not until 1317, so you know that some of the facts are probably going to be skewed a little bit. When you look at our politicians now, who just from a few years ago say, I do not recall that. Some of our guys either recalled it or didn't or made it up. There's no clear list of the original First Fathers until 1465, which is 200 years after the traditional founding. So the important thing, I guess, is that those facts are not a great concern, and they certainly weren't a great concern for Peregrine Graphius, already quoted by Val today at the prayer. He doesn't worry about the fact that it doesn't have a lack of names or a clear leader, but he wrote this. The common project of our first fathers might have failed, except that they made their dream a reality by doing it together. It's like the seven shared a vocation, were possessed by the same spirit, moved by the same ideal, captivated by the same vision, and with the same desire to become one. That's the end of the quote. And as it happened, the seven holy founders were the first non-martyr saints in the history of the church to be canonized together. So even though we don't have the kind of facts that a lot of people would pride themselves in knowing about the individuals, we pride ourselves in the fact that we were a community where the individuality wasn't as important. So imagine how delighted we were all recently in reading the latest apostolic exhortation of Pope Francis, Gaudete et Exsultate, in which he wrote the following words. I don't have these written, but growth in holiness is a journey in community, side by side with others. We see this in some holy communities. We can think, for example, of the seven holy founders of the Order of Servants of Mary, and then he mentions a few others. I don't remember who they were. But he mentioned us first. And so we thought this was great, and then those of us who got past the quote continued reading what he wrote, and he said, living or working alongside others is surely a path of spiritual growth. Okay, that's true, but then he continues and says, John of the Cross told one of his followers, you are living with others in order to be fashioned and tried. So I think that's kind of a papal way of saying communities can be a pain in the neck. Or somewhere. But a pain that nonetheless transforms us. And that's kind of what we're all about in the ideal. I could, with more time, go into lots of examples of how community is a pain in the neck. But I won't. In the Legenda, there's a line, for example, saying that the founders didn't want to be away from each other for even an hour. And that's when I knew that it was a legend. I think a few weeks or months would be quite refreshing. It's like a little girl who wrote this letter. Dear God, I bet it's very hard for you to love all of everybody in the whole world. There are only 4 people in our family and I can never do it. That's kind of like us. Thank you, little girl. In the 1330s, some Servite superiors of communities, not 1330, this is not that long after the founding, had Peter of Todi, a prior general of the order, excommunicated. Imagine excommunicating a prior general for false motives that turned out to be all politics. Interesting, and there are a lot more stories like that. We all know how truly countercultural the message of community and unity is, especially in our present American culture. So we've got some work to do, even as we're smaller and older, to be a witness to the fact that people can actually relate together, and people who are diverse. It's funny that for 18 years now there's been a show on TV called Survivors, with a premise of kicking other people off the island to win $1 million. And we, in a countercultural way, are trying to teach our Servite colleagues just the opposite, the kind of collegiality that's so central to our charism, as a way of collaborating and working together on the island, because it's like the only island we have, our planet. The order experienced various times of reform, and again, with more time, or if I had been asked to do a broader picture, I could go into those times because I find them really intriguing when there were attempts to try to get back to these ideals of the Founding Fathers. And it always included the centrality of community. Among the three parts of our charism, I'm really focusing mostly on this because I think it's never to be taken for granted and always the greatest challenge for people in general, and even certainly for our community. Even if we're doing good ministry and have great devotion to Mary, those other two components, Peregrine Grappius has a really challenging comment where he says this: service without unity becomes divisive and egotistic. And a Marian spirit without unity is a piety that might be personal and fervent, but as a characteristic of the order is non-committal, lifeless, and unconvincing. I didn't plan to say this, but interestingly, at one of the anniversaries, we had a big opening prayer at one of our chapters where we highlighted about 8 or 12 bright lights of the province who had done amazing things in the history of our province. And then one day I just mentioned to the others in the committee, did you realize that every one of these had trouble living in community? So once again, we're talking about the ideal here. One Servite named Montorsoli, not the sculptor Montorsoli, but another holy man named Giovanni Montorsoli, asked the Prior General to live as a hermit and wrote some incredible spiritual letters and books from the hermitage. The problem is, the word got out, they were so beautiful that the Pope pulled him out of his solitude and made him the Prior General. I'm glad popes can't do that now, but I certainly can empathize with somebody who would prefer to do something like, oh, let's say, spiritual direction, parish missions, retreats, rather than be in leadership. So at this early point in history, as we were beginning to be recognized by the larger church, Alexander IV, the Pope, wrote a document in which he highlighted the 5 elements of the order's early spirituality: service, Marian titles for our churches, it goes deeper than that, that's what he said, a commitment to contemplation and liturgy. That hasn't always been a part of us, although we have had long times of renewal, a corporate vow of poverty, and adoption and observance of the rule of St. Augustine, for whom being of one mind and heart is the reason that we come to live together in the first place, and the central goal of religious life. Our ministry, according to the Friars' Constitutions, is also about extending that community, extending that fraternity to the people of today. I just went, just a couple of weeks ago, to a 90th anniversary celebration of Seven Holy Founders Parish in Afton, Missouri, which isn't ours anymore. We were there for 88 out of the 90 years, so the new pastor very sensitively invited me to represent the Servites at the parish. And I was so happy to hear a number of the parishioners, in an unsolicited way, refer to the golden age of the parish. And the golden age that they were talking about is when Bob Orsey, Joe Chamblin, Don Seipel, and John Fontana were the community there. We were all on the younger side, which was already a coup, but more important than the age, we were happy to be together, which isn't the case in every community. And it spilled out into our ministry. That's the best example I have of the highest compliment I think that could be given to a Servite. That somehow or another, the real felt sense of being together in community showed, and showed in a positive way, and influenced the ministry. We don't always have that luxury, sometimes because of the mission that some of us are in, or because of the communities now, as we age, we're just less publicly present. But people know if we're getting along or not. And so that was a tremendous compliment. The unity, that kind of unity, is often considered to be the Servite pearl of great price. It's a model to strive towards, since we don't always do it well. But it also, and I love this phrase, I don't remember where I got it, but that kind of unity is the test that measures our authenticity in every age. If we're being authentic, there's something about the way that we're united. An additional challenge today, at least for the friars, maybe to some degree with the sisters, but for us, is to learn how to form that kind of unity in multicultural ways as well. Right now we're down, believe it or not, to 38 friars in the United States, which is incredible. But we have 5 other people, 2 from India, 1 from the Philippines, and 2 from Indonesia, that will hopefully grow if our government will allow them in through the immigration process. But that's the new challenge, I think, to form unity in a much more international way because of the demographics here in the United States. Father Chris Ross, in his book on the charism, points out that the order was originated by lay persons, not by ordained people, that there were no outstanding individual figures, which I've already kind of said, and that decisions were made collegially. It's not a top-down thing. It's funny how the leaders of our high school in the Grotto now are saying, well, you're the provincial, can't you just declare it? I said, oh. I could. We've had provincials who have done that, believe me. That's how I got my first assignment. But it's meant to be done collegially. It's what I'm more comfortable with, but it's also a Servite way. So one of the most important collegial decisions made by the 7 founders in Florence was to get out of Florence and go there. Our holy mountain, Monte Scenario. Our early history, it might be said, really doesn't begin with an event or a date or a document, because they're all kind of fishy and uncertain. What it begins with is 7 human persons who, in the spirit of the gospel, were attentive to the movement of the Holy Spirit within them. So the decision to leave the city for Monte Scenario in 1245 came as a result of the 7 all sharing their individual prayer, their personal prayer, and what each of them heard in prayer, and they ended up hearing the same thing. The founders were also part of a penitential movement at the time, which was one of the rationales as well, because it included things like ascetical practices like fasting, contemplation, the search of solitary places. This is about 18 kilometers outside of Florence, and the simplicity of life. As we find out later, it wasn't all spiritual. There were also some political reasons for getting out of town. The Guelphs and the Ghibellines were warring with each other, and we were on the side of those who were not in power at the time, the papal people. And so we got out of town. This is also a time, though, in which there was heavy critique of the institutional church, which wasn't living out its faith and its mission very well. And so people were making attempts to live the gospel more radically, more poorly, non-violently, which hasn't always been the case in the church, and generously. And interestingly, it's some of the communities that are doing that most visibly today that are getting the new vocations. We might have some other complaints about their theology, but it's a countercultural thing. We had one person who decided not to enter the Servites because he said, if I'm going to give up all that I'd have to give up to join religious life, I want to do something more radical than what you guys do. That was a real wake-up call. Another reason for their move was that crowds were beginning to be more and more attracted to them, wanting their spiritual advice, which sounds like a really good thing, but for a time it seemed to be a distraction from their desired focus on prayer and penitence. So the Legenda, which talks about these years, highlights the importance of Scenario as a place for their own spiritual growth and development. I mention this especially because it's a constant challenge for us to live our charism in a way that balances the action and contemplation, that balances prayer and work, that balances solitude and community. How do we all develop, and this is for everybody in the room, how do we all as followers of Jesus develop a more prayerful and attentive and contemplative way of living while continuing to be active? Even though the early Servites' time and Scenario was just a couple of years, it has become an ingrained image in us, in the order, of that constant call to solitude and an interior deepening. For almost the 800 years we've existed, during 400 of those years, reform movements were going on. They all have their own history, they all ended for various reasons, and that's not part of what I've been asked to talk about. But every one of them began in a time of apparent spiritual darkness, when there was too much wealth, when wars were being fought, and when spiritual and intellectual life were in decline. Wonder what kind of reform is needed right now. Whatever the external form might be, it would include ideals and values which are only rediscovered when we pray, when we live more simply, and when we remember what it is we've been called to. That was the homily part of my presentation. But it's absolutely true. For authentic religious life isn't lived without ongoing personal conversion. Oh, it's lived without it, and we see the results. But it's not meant to be lived without ongoing personal conversion. The Servite Giovanni Montorsoli, who I mentioned when he wrote the most famous, his spiritual letter, writes, "The only possibility of reform lies in voluntary efforts at individual spiritual renewal according to the Sequela Christi, the following of Christ, the essence of which is contemplation in love." And the more we talk about these things, the more simple it gets in the end. It's just getting to the simple. Peregrine Grappius adds, "Unless we are lovers, actively engaged in extending to others that love of God which has transformed us, we haven't understood very much about our calling. Unless we become lovers, engaged in extending that love to others." The one who best models that loving way of life, attentive to the Spirit of God, compassionate in presence to others, is our patroness. Sorry about the quality of the picture, but this is the famous Annunciata church painting of part of the Annunciation. We just did 2 windows in a renovated Assumption, and the 2 windows actually, we found some artists who did a great job of imitating the 2 faces. I just included Mary here. Supposedly the face was painted miraculously overnight because the artist didn't just know how to paint the Madonna's face in a way that would be fair to her. I don't always tend to believe stories like that, but when you see the face of the angel, I think maybe this was a miracle. The angel wasn't quite as good. So here we have Mary, who provides, it for the purposes of his history in this presentation, kind of a bridge between the time on the Holy Mountain and the movement out to the rest of the world, the everyday, whether it's experienced as a desert that needs to be nourished or as a lush place that just continues to grow, but with a sense of service that we see as typically Marian and Servite. So every age expresses its love for the Mother of Jesus according to the language and mindset of the culture. So these are a lot of words. I'm sorry, I know that PowerPoints really shouldn't have so many words. But in medieval Europe, our 7 founders, feeling themselves to be poor and humble and in need of conversion, limited their freedom and became servants, obligating themselves to serve Mary as their lady, a very medieval kind of spiritual thought, in exchange for her help and protection and patronage. And so she'd be known under titles of Our Lady and Queen of Mercy. And she would help these men of penance to reach Christ and to reproduce the image of Christ in themselves. They named churches after her, and by the end of the 13th century, regular devotional practices were part of Servite life. And for the friars, it was, well, only the friars existed then, it was always the first chapter of the Constitutions. It was always about Marian spirituality. Every prayer began with the Hail Mary, most of our official prayers still do, and ended with the Salve Regina. Every Saturday was dedicated to Mary, beginning with the Vigil of Our Lady on Friday evening. So even when we took on a more Augustinian character in the 14th and 15th centuries, and even from the beginning, the reason we did this in part is because new communities were rising up all over the place and the Vatican was suppressing them. And so there's a story about how there really were more documents that St. Philip had in his hand once, and they ended up being taken maybe by the devil and thrown into a well. But what he actually did was hid them so the Pope and everybody wouldn't know we were Servites. We pretended to be Augustinians for a while. Jesus did say, be clever as serpents as well as gentle as doves. So Philip, our leader, did that. Even when we took on this more Augustinian character, in order to avoid these restrictions, Mary always remained. And the legenda of the 14th century stressed the Marian character of their whole lives and communities and service, along with our name. It was only in the 15th century that we really began to stress the sorrow of Mary at the foot of the cross. That was not part of our initial charism. But it became our main symbol of Mary, kind of the icon of Mary for us, compassionately standing at the crosses of those who continue to suffer today. Other devotions came later, including the Rosary of the Seven Dolours, the Seven Sorrows, and statues of Mary that look like this. And I can never look at this statue without thinking about something that happened at Our Lady of Sorrows in Chicago, where this little African-American kid was in the middle of a catechetical moment when sister or teacher was talking about the Assumption. And so she said, now we know that Mary was assumed into heaven. Do you think Mary died before she was assumed into heaven, or do you think she was assumed alive? And the one little kid puts up his hand and said, of course she'd be dead. She got stabbed with all those swords. Of course she'd be dead. Fool. So she became the I don't expect you to read all that. She became the principal patroness of the order in 1669, declared by the Vatican as such. And this is already the 17th century that this is happening, the year after her feast day was approved as a universal feast day of the church. And so our Servite Feast of Our Lady of Sorrows has become the official church's feast of Our Lady of Sorrows. This particular version of Mary as Our Lady of Sorrows was then the one who had the primary Marian influence on the feminine congregations that would develop later in the 19th, 20th centuries. Interestingly, the Vatican II document on the liturgy reduced a lot of the Marian devotions, some of which had gotten out of hand. We're really more into the Mary of Scripture, not the Mary who appears on tortillas or trees or wherever else she happens to show up. With all due respect to people who have those experiences. The papal exhortation, Marialis Cultus, which was written in 1975, is an absolutely wonderful document still to be read about solid Marian devotion. The signature at the end of the exhortation is Pope Paul VI. He's not really the author. The author was a Servite, Ignacio Calabrich. And it's absolutely fantastic. Puts her in a good context of feminine anthropology and Bible and Scripture and history and Trinity and Christology. It's really, really well done if you want to read something about Mary that's really solid. So now, and again, this isn't part of what you asked me to talk about, but the Marian charism has changed. So in a way it is, rather than referring to Mary as lady and queen, which are definitely medieval kinds of words that were used, our devotion has changed, and maybe it's different for the sisters, but more and more toward Mary as woman of faith, servant of God, symbol of unity and hope, who's very much respected by both Jewish and Muslim communities of the religion that believes in one God, and a prophetic woman of peace and justice. Though she's not known for a whole lot of nonviolent action or protest, she didn't carry placards around, but she is seen as the model of living the gospel, and when it was declared that peace and justice is an integral part of living the gospel, she certainly does that as well. And let's admit it, suffering continues to be a part of every age. It's never old. Well, it gets old for those who are in pain, but we have plenty of people at whose crosses we can continue to stand. And so there's still something about, even though we got rid of the kind of the humility and littleness of Mary as she was seen at some periods in history, there's still something about that littleness, both in terms of our worldwide community that's never been all that big, but also in our spirit and way of serving that continues, again, in the ideal, to reflect the humble handmaid. So now we're going to leave the mountain with Mary and go to the last of the three dimensions of our charism, and that's service. We have often said, I know both the men and women Servites have often said that servants of Mary, which is a medieval term, really would be better translated for today as servants as Mary, or servants like Mary, or servants with Mary, any one of those. It's not a matter, we have found, unlike some of the communities, to have a particular kind of ministry to offer the church in the world, as much as the spiritual and interior attitude with which we do that ministry. That's why, again, I repeat, we're constantly called to find that healthy balance between prayer and ministry, between community life and service. Mary's servanthood is always found in a total faith and total readiness to serve. In a nutshell, we could say that faith is always her response to God, service is her response to humanity and the church. That's who we follow. That's who is our inspiration. And it could be summarized with two Latin words, fiat and stabat. I love that Annunciation scene. Just so different than what we're used to. And I just happened to stumble into the Mary at Calvary. And I picked it mostly, not only because she has a contemporary face, but also because it's multiple crosses. We don't stand at the cross of Jesus of Nazareth, but we do stand at the cross of Christ, present in the suffering of others. Fiat, be it done to me according to your word. Her free acceptance of her vocation at the Annunciation, and then Stabat, standing at the cross of people in pain. Like Mary at the moment of her fiat, we believe that God can make possible what seems to be impossible and uncertain. We're really challenged to that. I'm preparing a homily right now for our chapter in a week and a half. And I'm really focusing on that. How much have we really depended on God? We preach it to everybody else, but we're getting to a point where we're coming to the limits of our abilities for all kinds of obvious demographic reasons. A Brazilian Servite, Clodovis Boff, brother of a more famous Boff, writes that Marian service today might also be a service of liberation of people, part of the historical and social dimension of our faith, a noble struggle for justice. No, it's not unique to Servites, obviously, but the image of Mary standing prophetically and compassionately at the foot of the cross continues to inspire us to identify what those crosses are, and some of them aren't just of individuals, some of them are systems that are unbelievably corrupt, and we might have something to say to those in whatever way we can do that kind of advocacy, like you were telling me about yesterday with the trafficked women. To bring comfort and hope to those who suffer, but also to alleviation of some of the social causes of that suffering, unnecessary suffering, so that people can be free and experience the joy of Christ, which has been promised to us. Our service then, and I'm repeating this because it cycles around all the time, ideally is to be rooted in our contemplation. We serve others in response to what we hear in prayer and share with each other. I think the women religious have always been better at that because you haven't been tied down by priesthood and dioceses. And so you've been able to listen to other forms of service, and you've done other forms of service, which is a freedom that I wish we had. Unlike Jesuits who teach, although they do lots of other things, Dominicans who preach, Franciscans who, pretend to be poor, Servites minister in a style that some have called an apostolate of attraction. Even when the founders went to Monte Scenario, people followed them there. And in a wonderful letter written to the order by Hubert Moons when he was the prior general, called Sent to Serve, he writes these words: "The order has always preferred in its pastoral work the method of attraction over showy and institutionalized methods. In other words, it prefers the way of the lowly and free through the witness of prayer, fraternity, self-denial, and solitude." Beautiful words. Heck of a challenge to actually come out of that as our way of serving. Even the saints of the order have often preached with their lives. They're not famous, most of them. Some with the spirit of simplicity, some with their obvious joy, mercy in the need of healing, some with prophetic courage and love for the oppressed. We say officially that we prefer to serve together as community. And in the vocation study that was done not too long ago, a lot of young people prefer communities that do serve as communities and not just individuals doing their thing. The communal life is really meant to be the main form of our proclaiming the gospel, another real challenge. From the most quiet witness of the hermits to some of the most politically and publicly out there people who are very much involved in politics, like Paolo Sarpi at the Council of Trent, or maybe someone like David Tiraldo in Italy, or possibly even John Pelikowski now, and I'm just speaking in terms of the friars. This Servite style of service is inspired by Mary, the humble yet prophetic one, who inspires us to stand with others, not to stand above them. I get so tired of ministry that's seen as, I have something and you don't, and I'll give you what I have. Some of the best ministry I've done is where I help people to identify what they've already got inside them and draw it out. That's kind of a Servite way of serving. In the words of the epilogue of the Constitutions, since the Son of Man is what he called himself, it's not meant to be sexist language, is still being crucified in his brothers and sisters, we, servants of his mother, wish to be with her at the foot of those countless crosses in order to bring comfort and redemptive cooperation. And then the second quote, it's not just about standing at the crosses, but we also strive to heal the broken and reconcile those in our world divided by age, nationality, race, religion, wealth, and education. I really wish we were bigger, in a lot of ways, so that we could make more of an impact in a world that needs that so badly. And yet I remember, I think it was Richard Rohr who said Jesus never came to start a movement where the majority would be his followers, but rather we were there to be salt of the earth and a little bit of light in darkness and the leaven that grows or that helps the rest to grow. So as small as the Servite Order is, can you think of a better mission statement than that for our world right now? A broken, violent, polarized, hurting world. Despite the lack of original documents and writings by our founders, here we are, coming up on 800 years. I can't predict the future, obviously, but to the extent that we're faithful to these roots, to these ideals and values of our 13th century founders, along with the continued prayer and protection of our patroness, Mary, there might be some more anniversaries to celebrate. We'll be coming up on one among the friars. This is Our Lady of Sorrows Basilica, for those who may not have been there. We'll be coming up in 2020 with 150 years in the United States. If, on the other hand, we're meant to end, like some communities do, well, then I guess we have to start practicing what Mary said, let it be done according to your word. That's a possibility. In the meantime, this tree that was rooted in Jesus and planted in Tuscany is continuing to grow, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk a little even about just the trunk and to celebrate the branch that has grown into the Servite Sisters of Omaha, who have lived and served so well and in so many ways in the United States for the past 125 years. So enjoy your yummy salads in the coming weeks and the gift of our spirit, which will continue to be talked about by the other speakers. Thanks for the opportunity. You said you hadn't heard me for a while. Are you sorry now that you heard me again? I took up all the time.
There's still time for questions.
Are there any questions or comments? Comments might be good too, because if you have questions, I may not have the answers. Or something you'd want to share. Mary?
I think that was terrific.
Well, that kind of comment I like. She said, you want to use that? Say that on the microphone.
That was terrific. I think it needs to be prayed over. I'd give anything to have not anything. A copy of that. Seriously, to pray over it.
Sure. No, I'd be glad to. Jenny?
I don't know if I'm going to give you a microphone.
I'll give you the steak. No, I just wanted to say, being a member of the community, it was just a real boost. Like, you made me want to do all those things better. And I thank you for that.
You're welcome. I found that happening in me too. I'd like to do it not as provincial, but, well, I could go into that, but I won't. That's not why I'm here. Anybody else?
No.
I I'm safe too. You made me realize all over again how we take community for granted, but it is so significant to who we are. And I think sometimes we forget that, because it really is. I mean, I'm sure that's why I joined this community, because of the element of community that I saw in the sisters I knew. And in some other communities, I didn't see that. So it's very significant. And you said it so well, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I find that as we age too, we could escape community and just pour ourselves into our work so easily. And then when the work's not there, so what are we going to do all day? I've got to hang out with her or him, you know. And that's a real, it's a new kind of challenge to be living in community that way. I remember, I told two of you yesterday, we had one of our guys who was really a character and kind of blustery. When I came for visitation one year, he says, "I'm going to die with my boots on." And I said, "You are already wearing slippers. Give me a break." And the same guy also said, not to me, he was very nice to me, he still had some respect for the office, I guess. But as soon as I left, he told one of the other guys he lived with, "John Fontana will be in a nursing home before I ever go to one." And that might be the case, because he decided to die instead.
I appreciated the interpretation of servant as free, because I struggled with the title Servant of Mary, and especially in a setting where people aren't familiar with religious communities, that to interpret that a little different. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yes, Therese.
I just wanted to say that I appreciated all of the little asides as well as the content. So it made it very enjoyable.
Well, thank you.
As well as valuable.
The asides were put in because I knew this was going to be done after we ate. Mark Twain said, "If you're going to tell them the truth, do it with humor or they will kill you." Anybody else like to make a comment or ask a question or say something profound or... Oh, Val, it'll be profound.
Nothing profound, but I was thinking back, you quoted Peregrine Grathias so much, and, I did too in the prayer, but when I was working at the grotto before I joined the community, certainly the sisters were part of my attraction to the community, the compassion that I saw in the community there. But Peregrine came and gave us at the grotto, the workers at the grotto, a history of the Servite order, and that was very influential to me because he made some of the same points, and it made sense to me, and was very much of a draw.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are you having fun following me to the camera?
Mary?
How is Peregrine?
He's never been better, but he's in heaven. Yeah, it's amazing, really. Even I think we lost. Maybe lost, if I'm not mistaken, 8 people in 2014, maybe 17 since then. Yeah, Peregrine died a few years back. I've started answering that question more and more the way I did just now. I said, "Oh, he's doing great." I certainly hope what we believe is true, otherwise the celibacy. There better be a heaven. Okay. I thank you all very much. Everybody's still awake. That's great for starters. It is so good being with you. I'll be leaving tomorrow at some point. I'm not sure or when, sometime maybe later morning. But thank you for the invitation. We have our chapter coming up in just a week, so there's lots to do before then. And then I head out to South Africa shortly after that to visit our delegation there. And we had 2 different dates for this one, and this one really worked out much, much better, so I'm glad it did. Thank you for coming. I hope the rest of this, I'm sure Lisa's going to pack them in when she talks. I have the microphone, so I'm going to use it. No, thanks very much.